Welcome to the Meaningful Revolution podcast, where we talk about people's passions and hope to inspire you to your own. We also answer the question, what if you could just add 1% more meaning to your life every day for the next year? So join us on this Meaningful Revolution. I'm your host, Shawn Butner, certified high performance coach, and we have a really great episode for you today, so let's get into it. Hey everyone, I am Shawn Butner, certified high performance coach, and I am really excited to be talking with my good friend James Hultgren today on the Meaningful Revolution podcast. So James and I go way back to kindergarten. He's been a teacher, he teaches English and has done that for 17 years. He's been an instructional coach for 10 years. We'll get into what all that stuff means here in a little bit. And I'm really excited about talking about his passion for teaching today. So with that said, James, welcome to the Meaningful Revolution podcast. How are you doing, my man?
Thanks for having me.
We're talking about your passion for teaching, and we'll get into that. But could you tell us a little bit about what an instructional coach is, what you do as an English teacher, and what kind of initially got you excited about this topic of teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. So I teach at a high school in the western suburbs of Chicago, just about half hour outside the city. Uh, some just amazing kids, great community. And so this is my 17th year, going into my 17th year as an English teacher, and then starting my 10th year as an instructional coach, like you said, Shawn. And both roles are very different. As an instructional coach, I kind of have two primary roles. I meet one-on-one with teachers and support them with really anything as it relates to teaching. So I have a certification in reading. So I have a master's in reading, and I'm a certified reading specialist. But I really support all the teachers in our building. There's two of us in our building. Our building's pretty big. If we have around 2,500 students, 170 teachers. And so my colleague and I are the two support people. So if teachers want to meet to talk about a challenge they're having in the classroom, they want to help analyze some data that they've collected on their students, they have an upcoming evaluation, they want to brainstorm a way to change a lesson or implement a new idea. I mean, there really is no off limits. Sometimes they just want to meet to vent. So there's really no limit to what I'm there to do as a support. And then in addition to doing that, I teach two classes. For the past few years, I teach a class called AP Research, which is a newer class. If our viewers are adults, I'm assuming these are mostly adults listening, unless any of my students tune in. AP Research is a newer class that's part of this capstone program that the College Board offers. So it's a 2-year, 2-course program, and it culminates with students conducting their own authentic research in my class, and then doing essentially a mini dissertation where they have to do a literature review on their topic, identify a question, conduct their own authentic research, and write about it. And then the year finishes, they spend all year on a 15 to 20 page paper that they send to the College Board, and then they do an oral defense presentation. So I teach that course, and then I work with a different group of students who have been identified over just some concerns about they're on the bubble between are they going to graduate? Are they on track to graduate? And so I get the opportunity to work with them and really just be sure that they're getting back on track, that they're staying on track, and that they're having their especially social and emotional needs met, because oftentimes that's a barrier for them, especially post-COVID, which I'm sure we'll talk about education post-COVID.
Definitely. So, okay, so that's what you do. It sounds like you're helping teachers. You get to teach two classes for folks that are doing really well and might be struggling. So a huge type of what do I want to say? You're covering a lot of ground there with student experience in the schools. So I'm really curious about this, because I don't think we've ever talked about this point, but how did you decide to go into teaching? Was there a particular moment where you're like, oh, this is what I want to do? or something that drew you into the profession? I'm guessing probably over 17 years ago, probably like 21 years ago or whatever when you started college, I'm guessing.
Yeah. One moment, I don't know. Growing up, I think there was just one thing that I knew whatever I did professionally, I wanted to make a difference. And so, as we got towards the back end of high school, Shawn, you and I went to high school together. Uh, that just felt like a really natural fit for my personality. I don't think you had our English teacher, Mr. Kalish, but
No.
in English too, in sophomore English, we were reading Jurassic Park as part of the curriculum. And I remember there was an entire class period one day where I was the only one who I think had really done the reading in the class. And he and I spent, at least my memory, I'm probably distorting it now after 20, what are we, what would that have been? 25 years ago almost. But
Yeah.
my memory is that he and I spent most of the period just talking about the book, just back and forth, and everyone else was just sitting there listening to us. But that probably isn't how it actually went down in hindsight. If there was a camera, we could go back and rewatch it. But my memory was he and I sitting and talking, and I just really enjoyed um, the exploration of literature and just I think what great literature does, and I think Jurassic Park is a great piece of literature, maybe not a classical text, but what literature does is it gets at the human condition and gets at the challenges that uh, any of us can face. And I know for many times in my life when I've been experiencing challenges, I'll think about how fictional characters overcame those challenges or were able to face those challenges head on and overcome them. And so, for me as an English teacher, that is especially when we're talking literature. To me, that's my what I care about when we discuss literature is how can we use these stories as a way to um, better ourselves, especially in moments of adversity.
I love that. And do you find that through your teaching that students really connect to that idea of exploring how to behave and act in the world through these characters?
Sometimes, yeah, I wish I could tell you absolutely, Sean. Every student who walks in and out of my class is just a changed individual. I can't promise you that, but um, that's certainly where I try to focus when we're talking literature. But you know, um, English class has changed quite a bit since you and I were in high school. English in high school was about reading novels, at least in my school and in our department. It's no longer about, every quarter you read another novel and you write a 5 paragraph essay at the end of that novel, and then you move on to the next novel and do you remember doing like that grind where every night you had another chapter of
Yes.
Pride and Prejudice, and then after 8 weeks you took the test and you wrote the essay and then you moved on. What English classes has become is when we're trying to, at least in my school and in my district, and there's a national movement around this, is really thinking about English as a way to do a couple things. One, redefine when we say text, what do we mean by text?
Yeah.
Text isn't just literature. Text can be art, it can be podcasts, it can be movies, it can be film, it can be videos, it can be nonfiction, it can be fiction, it can be short stories, it can be really anything, right? Anytime where you are experiencing a medium and then analyzing that medium, we want to redefine text. And then how do we make our big question is how do we make our class relevant in the sense that we're preparing students for all of the communication skills that they're going to have to do after high school. Very
Yeah.
few, I think when we went to high school, the way that we experienced English class was it was like they were preparing us to be English teachers in the future. It was like we're going to read these books and we're going to study these books, and then someday, maybe you'll become an English teacher or you'll become an English major. I did, but most
Yeah.
of us didn't. And so if you weren't going to become an English major or you weren't going to just spend all of your free time reading literature, I'm not sure, other than the critical thinking and the reading, there's a lot of good skills that come with that. But what we're trying to do now in English is be more intentional about recognizing that not every student's going to become an English major after high school.
Right
And
on.
so how do we help them do experience different types of reading and thinking critically, looking at arguments, especially, and understanding how arguments are crafted, especially out in the real world, having them experience different types of writing that are not just 5 paragraph essays. Sean, how many 5 paragraph essays have you written since you graduated high school and college?
Oh, 0. I
Zero.
really I mean, maybe the closest thing would be a blog,
Yeah.
which I actually have some questions on that for you, maybe
Yeah.
in a little bit, on just how. But I love how you're talking about how things have shifted in this new information-rich world we find ourselves in. Like I studied information systems and how information moves through it, but the inputs are the skills and the writing and the content and the things that you're talking about, videos, podcasts, and all that stuff. So
Yeah.
um, that's super fascinating thinking about how do you survive in this? Because I think if you take a look around broadly, you see that people are struggling in this environment.
Mhm.
A lot of us weren't prepared. But there are those of us that grew up with this stuff, and I think kind of discounted how impactful and how I'm gonna say strange the world is now with just the amount of like how do you see the world in 144 characters? If that's one of your lenses. So, and I'm sure you probably talk about that a bunch. But okay, so to take kind of backtrack though, so you had that moment talking about Jurassic Park, and having known you for forever, like I feel like, and maybe I'm understanding this a little bit more, that you could have just as easily gone into like film study.
Mm.
So was there a choice there, or was it just like I'm following like this feels right? Like, how did you know in that moment that this is what I want to do, or was this just like a spark that led you forward going into college?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was that moment. Growing up, my dad and I, we would read poetry together, and we'd sit on the couch together, and he'd read poetry to me. And then when I was old enough to read, we'd read together. And so I think from a young age that the interest in language and words, and really paying attention to how little things can make a big difference, how something is phrased, how something is said,
Yeah.
just an interesting word choice, really kind of led me down that path. And then that was when I decided. Yeah.
Oh, right on. Okay. Okay. So then I'm wondering, as you've been on this journey, so you make the decision at some point that you're going to be an English major. Like that's your thing. From I love that you highlighted your dad. Like, what was that poem you always talked about? Was it like The Traveler?
Vagabond House by Don Bland.
Vagabond. Yeah. I remember you quoting that a lot in high school, which was really, really fun. And I guess I should point out to the viewers now too, because this feels right. A lot of our time in high school was talking about stuff like this on this golf course that we probably were walking around illegally at night, and like sharing stuff like that and having that type of deep connection and conversation is why I'm a coach. There's an episode earlier on in the podcast where I talk about, walking with my friend, and this is the friend. So I thought, if you're following me here, like this is a cool like Easter egg thing. But um, so make that decision. What do you think surprised you on your journey from, you know, being interested in language and word choice and literature and how it helps you develop as a well-rounded human being? And you didn't say that, but those are my words. Um, into like starting your career as a teacher 17 years ago, which is kind of crazy to think about when I
Great.
say it out loud.
We're old. We're getting old.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
So if I'm understanding your question, it's how have I what have I realized as I've gone through my career, or
What were things something that like surprised you about during that process, right? Maybe something you learned about yourself or something that presented an opportunity for you to take that you maybe wouldn't have had otherwise. Just be following your passion, following this feeling that, oh, this could be cool. Um, or was there, I mean, it doesn't mean that there has to be something, but was there anything that kind of surprised you on your study of English, of teaching, of interacting with students out in the world?
um yeah, I this goes back to some of the changes that we're making in our English curriculum, which is shifts in the kind of text that we're reading. Earlier in my career, and I think when we were in high school, we were reading pretty much all like old dead white dudes. Those were our authors, those were the texts. And I think we just accepted that that was what you read and what you experienced, and that those authors' experiences were what we were supposed to take away about the world and how it works. And as I'm now, 17 years into this, I have become much more reflective about the text that I
Mhm.
select in my classes. We are very blessed in our school to have a really diverse population of students, with racially, both socioeconomically, culturally, and so you know marching through a curriculum where it's the same type of author, and they were reading older texts written by the same type of person. We've made some shifts there because ultimately we want our students to experience kind of two things. We call it windows and mirrors. We want students to experience texts where they're looking through windows into new worlds, experiencing things they've never seen before. Being immersed in all kinds of uh, times and situations that are new, but then that mirror piece, right, where we want times where students can read something or experience a text and see themselves reflected back at them. And I think for a long time it was really just lots of windows, and what we're trying to do is add more mirrors into our curriculum as well, so that students feel like this is not just about these other people who lived at this other time that I can't relate to, but I see myself in these texts as well.
Right on. Are there any particular like new favorite books or things that you think everyone should read to have? And I know it depends on the person,
Yeah.
because somebody's window might be another person's mirror, to use your terminology. But are there any personal books that you found through this process that were a window into another world that surprised, delighted you, or informed your view on the world?
Can I take your question in a different direction?
Sure.
Do I have your permission? Um,
Yeah, yeah. If I don't like it, I'll ask the question
just no,
again.
no,
So
you're gonna give me a book. We're not moving on to give me a book. Um, there's no one book that comes to mind, but it, one of the things that we are working on, and one of the things I didn't mention in my little background about what an instructional coach is we also run professional development for the district. And
oh,
one of the
mhm.
professional development pieces that I am a part of is this it's called authentic performance tasks. And so what we want to try and do in our curriculum is to move away from asking students questions in which they can just Google the answer. Uh, when you think about a lot of tests that we took in high school, that was not, we can't say pre-internet, but certainly pre-smartphone,
Free
pre
Google.
pre-Google for the most part. We had to know a lot of stuff, and there is value in knowing information and knowing things. You don't always have a computer handy, or it's good to
Right.
know things, But what we want to do is kind of have a meld, right? Where we students need to know things, they need to understand concepts and have knowledge on our topics. But then how do we have students engage with those topics in authentic ways where there's more of a performance? So before I go too deep into that, Sean, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Right. What is something from high school when you think about an experience in your classroom that you really remember as being an impactful learning experience for you?
That's a really good question. Let me access the old memory banks. I immediately think of a couple of teachers, right? So I had my physics teacher, Mr. Kaliza. Um, I know, I think
Mhm.
we had a conversation about him a bit ago, but just kind of remembering him. So I was super interested in physics, and I asked him about like relativity, like how does this relate to anything we're learning in physics after class one day, and like the next time we met, so I think there's a day break and how the scheduling worked. He had a folder with everything, like basically a student's guide to relativity for high school physics level understanding. But like the amount of enthusiasm, the amount of passion he had for physics, like he did a bunch of ridiculous things. Like I remember we're doing we had a strobe light. He's like on one of those like big science tables, and he's like, because of how the blinking's gonna go, it's gonna look like I'm flying. And he was just like hopping on this table like a madman, but because he had synced it with the flashing, it looked like he was suspended in air. And he's like, isn't this cool? Like he did like tons of like kind of crazy things like that, and it really helped me appreciate science in a different way, especially physics. Like that was one of those topics too where like the content, like when you understand it, changes how you view things, in a weird way. You like think about like, oh, like that table is molecules with a bunch of space in it, and that's kind of crazy.
Mhm.
So like I remember that being very formative and very impactful, and also being like, if I wanted to get to the stuff that I was really interested in, I had to ask. You had to be engaged in the teaching process.
Mhm.
And I think, like looking back on that, I didn't quite realize it right away, but it did help me in college and kind of choosing what I wanted to study and whatnot. It's like, what would be interesting? What would be helpful? What helps me see the world in a different way?
Mm. So a highly engaged teacher who
Yeah.
made the learning relevant and it felt alive. It felt not like a multiple choice test. Like your mind didn't go to a test that you took where you had to pick A, B, C,
Yeah.
or D.
No.
Um, so I think, for me, when I think about my instruction and when I think about what I want my students to have experientially is lots of authentic opportunities to perform in ways that go beyond just a test, if you will.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? It can be something where we take what would have been a classic 5 paragraph essay, and now we finished Of Mice and Men, and instead of uh, giving me a 5 paragraph essay, um, we're going to have a trial in class, and everybody's going to have a role. You're either going to be a prosecutor, a defender. You're going to be one of the characters from the book. We're going to have a trial, not a trial. We're going to have a jury, and everybody has to do the same kind of critical thinking, writing, communication, but they're doing it to prepare for the trial. And now we're going to have that. Or as we finish To Kill a Mockingbird, instead of giving them a test, or maybe in addition to part of a test, we're going to think about what is it that makes Atticus such a difference maker in his community. Like what happens to Tom Robinson, even though he ends up dying tragically trying to escape? What
Right.
happens to that town without Atticus? What is it that makes him a difference maker?
Mm.
And then I'll have my students think about someone in our community or in their lives that's a difference maker and go out and conduct an interview where they have to do extend, they have to prepare the interview, they have to communicate and set that up, they have to record the interview, they have to reflect on that interview afterwards, and really try to convey to this person, I think you're a difference maker and I want to learn more about you, right? And now they're going to come back and they're going to say, how is my difference maker that I interviewed similar or different than Atticus? And they're going to analyze those two pieces, right? So suddenly it goes from just another assignment to something that's authentic, that they have they're personally vested in, and is way more relevant to them. And they built a connection with somebody, and they've done all kinds of great critical thinking skills. And I think that's what a lot of this comes back to, is how do we get students to do less memorizing and more critical thinking.
Okay. And it seems also through like a experience type model versus a rote regurgitating type thing. Like if you can create an experience around the learning you want to have happen, that'll stick with them much longer. If I'm hearing that correctly.
Yeah, what I try when I design my units, and it's not just me designing it. I work with some amazing colleagues, and we work closely to design things. I try to think of the question I asked you. When you think back to high school, what's a memory of something
Mhm.
you did where you learned something that really stuck with you? And we want to have lots and lots of those types of things, right? Where, not that it was just fun, we want students to be engaged, right? But there's a difference between engagement and fun, and even engagement exists on a spectrum. And a lot of times when teachers during that evaluation process, they'll meet with me and they'll say, okay, I know a big part of my evaluation is engagement. And engagement exists on a real continuum. There's compliance, which is like everybody took out their pencil when I asked them to. Everyone had their iPad charged. Like, that's compliant engagement. And then on the other, on the top end is that kind of engagement where students are really invested in what's happening. They're really invested in the outcomes. What matters is personal to them. They see the relevance to what's happening. They feel connected to the curriculum. And so trying to create as many of those opportunities for students, so that not just because it's fun, but because those times will come later in their life where they can use those experiences and say, boy, I know I can do this thing that's difficult in my adult life, because I've had all these experiences in high school where I had to go out and talk to real people, and I had to engage and consider the relevance of what was happening, and engage with real audiences beyond. And so I know I can do this because I've done this before.
Awesome, awesome. That's so. I'm thinking back, like I wish I had more of those experiences to like from when we were in high school. Like I think there were some are there, but that intention behind it, that I want to build this for the students, I think is really awesome and unique. So and so I guess shifting gears a little bit, and maybe I was going to ask you about, what have been some like struggles that you've experienced over the course of your career. I think the most glaringly obvious is probably COVID, the
Mm.
last 2 years, and a lot of these school board meetings with CRT and all that stuff, which is a third rail issue. But I think it's worth talking about with someone who is in education, because I feel like a lot of the things you see on the news, a lot of the things that you see just kind of happening on social media are people really upset about this topic. And my impression has been that it's people making noise, but not understanding what's happening on the ground, right? And how that impacts teachers and students. Um, to make maybe something, because it seems like you mentioned, I think there's been a bunch of like books that have been banned in some states. I think To Kill a Mockingbird's been one of them, and you just illustrated a really relevant, kind of going back to what you said before, of connecting character's struggle and how it impacts how you see the world or experience the world, and how much personal growth you can get or personal insight you can get about the world from that. So how do you see education post COVID? Um, is that is that even a struggle? I'm assuming it is, but you tell me. And then how do you think about all this crazy school board stuff that's been going out in the world?
Yeah,
They're big questions. So
huge questions. I think a lot of teachers would say that this past academic year was, in a strange way, more challenging than that COVID year.
okay.
Because we've had to grapple with students returning to school in person, and having spent over a year, in some cases a year and a half, in their bedrooms with their shades drawn, on their devices, and now they're coming back. And so, uh, you know, I'm going to take a rosy approach to what I think COVID taught me as a teacher.
Okay.
When COVID hit and we all went into Zoom, or it wasn't even Zoom at first. No one had a Zoom account. It was Google Meet because that was free, and then Zoom. Um, I think what COVID did for me was that it exposed on some level that what I had been teaching and how I had been teaching it, and uh, it was not as engaging as I thought it was. For me, when you're a teacher and you run the classroom, it's easy to think, boy, these kids love these books. They love what we're doing. They love these activities. Um, because you always have, every class, you've got like your 4 or 5 kids, right, that always have great eye contact and they're super engaged. And it's sometimes easy to maybe think that the whole class represents those highly engaged kids, or at least kids really good at faking like they're highly engaged. And so when we went into lockdown and now we're on Zoom, and we spent over a year, at least for me, cameras were not required to be on. And
Mhm.
so most days of teaching was, I could see myself, and then I was just looking at blank screens and names, and so just for me, I can't speak for all the other teachers out there, but I think it was a realization that, obviously we can't stay. This is not how learning was meant to happen. It needs to happen in person, and learning is very social. Learning is something, even for introverts, that needs to happen in a space where we can all share in that learning experience together at times. And two, that what I thought was really fun and engaging, when the rubber hit the road and we were all sitting at home, maybe it wasn't. And so I needed to rethink, um, how to make things more relevant for students. And now as we come back, and this past year, like I said, I think was harder than the COVID year, um, because we were trying to just return in some ways. We were very innovative during the COVID time. We tried new things. We trimmed curriculums. We cut out unessential worksheets, handouts, garbage that we used to just give because that's just what you did at this time. And we said, okay, we're just going to focus on, we have less time with the kids. We're getting less production from them. This is what really matters. And now we're back, and now we can bring all that other stuff back in, right, that we used to do.
Right.
And many students they just weren't having it. And it wasn't just students who were already disengaged with learning. These were our top kids. I told you I teach the top AP kids in our school in this
Mhm.
research course, and they've had to work to get there. That's been a journey to even be eligible to take that course. And this past year, we were missing deadlines, things were not getting turned in. And, I said, what's happening? Like, I need to understand what's happening. Can we just have a class meeting? I actually said, you guys have a class meeting. I'm going to go in the hallway, and you talk about what's happening, and then call me back in. I want to hear what you have to say, but I want you guys to just talk openly about what's happening, and then have somebody report out to me. And so I went in the hall, and they had a class conversation about my deadlines and my expectations,
Mhm.
and they called me back in, and I said, "So what's going on?" And they said, "We talked about it. We don't know. We don't know what's going on. We just don't care, and we're just not as motivated as we were. We just can't get done what we used to get done, you know." So it's really interesting because they couldn't really identify how my students couldn't identify how COVID had changed them, but their engagement was down, their production was down. And I think in some ways, even with all of, like I've told you, all my effort to make things relevant and authentic, um, I think that COVID highlighted that for some students, like the way they were doing school, it just wasn't engaging in the way that it maybe needs to be. And that's not just on teachers. We're not there to just put on a song and dance and engage them per se, but the way that we've been doing school and the way that school has been organized for a long time, I don't think it's working for all of our students. And when you think about 100 years ago, school was really about getting some essential knowledge in students, so then they could go work in factories and they could go really just be productive workers.
Yep.
And really what we that's not where we are now. We need productive innovators, and we need students who can think critically and create and produce, not just have some knowledge that we can say that they're, like quote unquote educated with some stuff, and then they go out. So, I think there's a lot happening. I realize there's probably 10 different directions we could take that.
Right.
But just to put a bow on it, I think COVID, at least for me, it helped to clarify what my mission was as a teacher, because we couldn't do as much. And now
Right.
as we've come back to continue to reevaluate if what I was doing before was really working, if I just convinced myself it was working, and then what can I do more of to make what we're doing relevant and set our students up for success after they leave.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm wondering, and I'm curious, like, how did your mission change pre-COVID to post-COVID? Like, what was that? Was it just getting more focused and realizing, for lack of a better word, that there's maybe fluff in the curriculum? Like if you're watching a TV show, there's like the two really good episodes and the ones that, at least maybe before all the streaming, were
Right,
like,
like,
oh, they
this
just
could have
got to
been a
come up with something.
two-episode thing, but they made it into 5, and you're like, "We coulda cut 3 of the 5 episodes."
Yeah.
Um, no, I think what shifted is how I define engagement, and I think for
Okay.
a long time, I was defining engagement really as compliance. Like, "Oh, class is going really well because most of the students are doing what I'm telling them to do." Um, and so when I shift that definition from engagement being they're doing what they're supposed to be doing to, wow, they're creating, or they're thinking critically, or they are finding connection or relevance, and because of that they're producing and doing really neat things. That to me is true engagement. And that's not going to be every day, Sean. I don't want to leave you or anybody who's listening to this thinking that like every day is this magical day of students like so excited to be there, and they just can't wait to come to class and to go to every class, and every day is this authentic experience. And that isn't true. But finding ways to incorporate more relevant and engaging and authentic opportunities for students, and then just realizing that just because students are doing what I ask them to do doesn't mean that they're getting the most out of that.
Right.
It's probably been the biggest shift for me.
Right on. So to kind of paraphrase again, it sounds like instead of just showing up, going through the motions, it being classified as engagement, it's finding meaning in the work itself. And I bring that idea, that phrasing, because I also think if you take a look at the economic landscape we're in right now, where there's people talking about the great reset or the great resignation, where people who had jobs that also had that kind of fluff, fluff, I'll put in quotes, but really it's like, if you've ever worked a job, and I've been in those jobs where like the value that you add could be done in 2 hours, but you're on the clock for 40 hours or 50 hours a week. And so you do like the thing where like you go to coffee, you do take long lunches with colleagues, like you're doing things to appear to be adding value because you already got your stuff done. Um, or you're tasked with all this kind of BS type stuff that the pandemic shook out because when you're working at home, you can focus and you can be more productive, essentially, getting the things done that you need to get done, and then not have to worry about those extra things. I think my impression studying this, having worked in corporate America for a while, is you have that like the pandemic, it was that moment of like what's really meaningful and important in this task.
Mhm.
And why am I being asked to go back to something where it's less meaningful, it's less connective, it's not building relationships. It's just you're there because somebody needs you to be there to um, watch you work, you know? So I think that's a really kind of interesting parallel
Yeah.
going out there in the world. And I'm not sure if you felt that in your job. Um, and I haven't felt it in my coaching career, but I definitely noticed it when I worked at Walmart before. Apple was a different experience together. They were really good at kind of letting you decide what the meaning of the work was and kind of following that. So I really enjoyed that part of that job. But yeah, so yeah, I just thought that's a really interesting thing to point out.
Yeah,
Um,
it really is, and I think, disengagement from
mhm,
school or from work is, I don't I think there's a couple ways to think about disengagement in education. It could be that for a long time, students, they didn't have they like, we lowered the expectations, because we had to streamline things, and we and so now students are being held to a higher expectation, and that's challenging. I think that's one piece of it, but I think the other piece of it is students spent a year and a half sitting in their rooms, and now they're back and they're like, I don't know how much I like I don't know how much of this matters. And I want meaning in what I'm doing. I want to feel like this matters. I want to feel like this is a worthwhile investment in my time, even though I have to be here. The law requires that I'm here.
yeah.
Just like workers who don't want to go back to that job because that wasn't fulfilling on
Mhm.
some level. And I don't want to say one, I don't want anyone to think that our curriculums are just fluffy with stuff they don't need. I don't think that's it, but I do think it's reevaluating what really matters, curriculum wise, and then finding ways to make it more relevant and engaging so students can see why this thing that we're reading or we're learning is going to help them later on. And it's not always just about knowledge, right? It's about skills, it's about critical thinking, it's about reasoning, it's about problem solving, but trying to paint that image for them as often as possible about why this matters or how it could matter in the future, I think, is what it ultimately comes back to, right? Because if students can
Yeah.
understand that there may be a time where this would be really helpful to think about what we're doing and why it matters. But yeah, I think there's a great parallel there, Sean. I think that's a really astute point.
Thanks. Yeah. Um, yeah. And again, I think to reinforce that point where it's not that there wasn't meaning out there in the things that we were doing before the pandemic. But I think that moments of big disruption or where innovation happened or when we reevaluate things and the great evaluation that happened from the pandemic across the board, as people redefine their lives, how they're working, how they're learning, and all that stuff, again, is kind of the big idea um, that kind of ties all these different types of areas together.
Yeah.
So that said, when we're talking about how you view teaching and how you view being an educator, because I'm not like, would you classify yourself as an instructional coach, as an English teacher, as maybe a more broad educator? Like, how do you self describe? And then I wanted to ask you, how do you think people that are like the top teachers in the world, What does that look like to you? What are the skills or kind of the things that you would look for in a top tier skill in that?
Yeah, boy, I work with some absolutely incredible people. And so, it's interesting, like if you said who's the best teacher in our building, you know, I I think there's a lot of ways to define best. Some teachers are just incredible at building relationships with students, and you walk by their room in their free period and the room is just packed with kids who wanted to come up during their lunch period and hang out in that space. Other teachers are incredible at designing unique experiences for students, and their classroom is just alive with energy and learning, and students just buy into what that mission is. Other teachers are just great at holding students accountable, and then through that high level of expectation and accountability, students rise to that. So um, I think like the best teacher can do all three of those pieces, right? Can build amazing relationships, can hold students to incredibly high expectations, and then can design learning that just is students, it's accessible for students, and students like the best learning that happens is when no one's asking about what's my grade going to be, or what can it be, right? It's transcended that that point in which this is about an assignment, and it's become incredibly personal to them, or they see the value in it, or they're just lost in the learning. And you almost don't want to give a grade, because then that kid's going to get a C even though they worked so hard and they were so in it. And you don't almost don't want to give a grade, because then that's going to somehow they're going to take that as a reflection on something that it wasn't meant to be, right? So yeah, those three pieces I think are essential to all grade instruction.
Right. And that this made me think about too, like a not related question, but like it always seemed to me in high school that your grade really didn't measure learning. It measured like standardized measurement for organizations or institutions. Because I would say the people that consistently were like in the A class maybe didn't do as much learning as people that were in like B, C range. And do you think that that's true? Or do you think, I mean, I think learning is very personal and it's really hard to make a generic measurement for everyone. And I realize I made a generic statement trying to like express that. So do you think grades are neutral? Do they hurt people? Do they help people? Or is it like kind of like some people are really motivated by that? That gets them going. So you need to like say, oh, you're not going to get an A unless you figure this out or learn this thing. Or are other people more receptive to the journey of it? And like maybe you come in as a D student and you get a B, like that is almost more impactful. I don't know. How do you think about that? That's kind of a really
Yeah, well,
question. We could
I-
probably do
I'll
another podcast
we
on.
could do a whole another couple hours on assessment literacy practices, and grading practices have shifted dramatically um, since you and I were in high school. And in many of the districts, including ours, we've moved to what we call an 80/20, which is that 80% of a student's grade is their exam scores, what they get on tests, projects, quizzes, those summative pieces, right? That they've practiced
Yeah,
recursively, and now this is your chance to prove it. The other 20% is on formatives. And so the formative is worksheets, practice quizzes, that type of thing, right? And so the spirit behind this is that students are going to practice and be intrinsically motivated to do the practice, because it's the end summative that will determine their grade. Whereas I think when you and I were in high school, a lot of our grade had to do with work completion. Were
yeah,
you turning in the homework? You remember how in the back of the math book, you remember they always had they had the answers for every other question.
Yeah.
in the math book, right? So you just write those like we were really tricking the teacher that we only answered the odd questions when we had to do one through 25 or whatever. So that type of thing is become de-emphasized in grading practices in our area. And now really it's about the exam. But back to your question, because that's a whole nother topic. The thing that's changed, I think, student grading or students' attitudes around grades more than anything, well, maybe not more than anything, but drastically, is that all of the grading is done electronically now. And so when I update a grade, students will get a notification on their phone or their iPad, if they've installed the grading app. And so suddenly they can see their grades in real time. And when you and I were in high school, it was like every week or two, sometimes even more, the teacher would come in, remember, and they'd put the piece of paper up with your ID, all the ID numbers for the class and the
Yeah.
current grade. And you'd go look and you'd be like, I'm at a B right now. Okay, I'll just keep going, And yeah, you got work back, but it wasn't so instant, So I'll update a grade or I'll put in an assignment and I'll get an email instantly from a student. Mr. Hultgren, I have a B now. What happened? What can we do? Can we meet? Whatever. And so, it's constant. And then added on top of that, parents can opt in to also receive those notifications. So grading is happening. um it's much more in everybody's mindset, because every update is being sent a notification to students and oftentimes parents who can see those grades evolving in real time, which has pros and cons.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a different concept. Do you think the instant feedback is then helpful, or is it changing the incentive for the student? Like, the incentive was always to get a good grade, but when it was a little bit murky, when we were in high school, you could kind of like you're kind of like going around, and then you're like, oh, maybe I need to work on this a bit more, focus on it more, or not. Like, oh, okay, I have a B. I'm okay as long as they don't really goof up the last assignment in the exam or whatever.
Yeah,
Like,
I don't know. I I I think I think it goes both ways. It depends on the student, but having constant access to grades, being alerted every time there's a grade change is just so different from what we experienced.
yeah,
Where I think I would go long stretches knowing that I wanted to get good grades, but really just doing what I needed to do, and then I'd get an update every so often on how that's going, but
yeah,
I wasn't constantly thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm 3/10 of away from an A now. What do I need to do? Oh, my mom's gonna see this because she's also checks that thing like a hawk, and
yeah,
now she's gonna talk to me about." And so I think that could go either way, right? Depending on who you are, but um, it's just so different.
yeah. It's super interesting. So, okay, shifting gears a bit, I wanted to ask you, as an educator, as a teacher, as an instructional coach, who do you think would be like the top three, 1 to 3 people that have influenced your career the most? That somebody might like go get their book or follow a lecture, see a TED talk. Are there any like of 3 people or pieces of content that really come to mind that really help define your journey as an educator?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's some Englishy people who have Penny Kittle is one of them. She's an author, and she works in conjunction with a few other professionals who have really kind of redefined and helped us all, I think, are English teachers in our area to rethink, uh, how we run class, and that break away from what I described at the beginning, which is that 4 by 4, right? 4 novels, 4 quarters,
Right.
grind through the novel, and trying to make class and more engaging, a broader variety of skills, broader application of real life scenarios. And so, she and a few others have been, huge. And when we attend different English conferences, you always try to seek out some of those folks.
Right on. Any other people come to mind?
Absolutely, Sean. It
I know.
come to mind though, like trying to conjure those names. Without talking about some of the incredible colleagues I have, I mean, I could certainly tell you about different colleagues who have had, just incredible influence on my ability to um, think about our role in education, that have made me just a better teacher, and helped me to put uh, students first, and kind of reframe the work that we do, which at the end of the day is really all about relationships. At the end of the day, like, this teaching stuff is my good friend who passed away a few years ago. He was my mentor, Eric Lemke. He used to say, some people around here, they act like this job, teaching, is so hard. This is not a hard job. You come in and you do your best to help build connections with students, and help empower them to be their best selves, and that's it. Like, as long as you're doing that, you're doing your job. And I think there's some real truth to that. Everything else comes secondary. And I think, since we went to the same high school together, Sean, when we talk about teachers that we revere or that we care about, I think it oftentimes had very little to do with what they knew. I mean, they had degrees and they taught the content, but
Right.
what lingered was who they were, how they treated us, how they made us feel.
Yeah,
um so I think that's ultimately what matters.
that's awesome. I love that focus on relationships, right? Because part of, I think, what helps people live meaningful every day is defined on their quality of their relationships. So I think that's a really good call out, tying it into the podcast, of how are we developing our relationships to family members, to peers, to students, to our management, communities, all that kind of stuff. It's such an important skill, and it's such an important thing to be cultivating if you really want to feel impactful, right? You don't feel impactful just explaining a topic. It's seeing it land with, and your profession, I'd imagine, land with a student who really gets it, and then is excited about how this skill, this topic, this thing is going to impact them in their lives. So, um, on that note, too, then, so a couple of people that have influenced how you've thought, and I keep kind of laughing as I really want to ask, like, could you rate your top three colleagues and your least favorite three colleagues? Because I think just putting you on the spot like that, I know that how you talk about your colleagues, that there's nobody in that second list, but it would kind of just put you on the spot, and as your friend makes me laugh.
Yeah.
Um, so, if you're talking to a new educator, what would you think would be maybe the one or three things for a new educator to keep in mind as they enter this profession to make it meaningful, to focus on those relationships, to be impactful?
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite
Yeah,
questions.
I love
So,
that question.
yeah,
Number one, you got to always remember what it was like to be a student yourself, and the
yeah,
times where I think been the worst teacher is when I forget what it must feel like to go to 8 different classes every day, have 8 different bosses telling you what needs to happen, and and I've stopped considering what their experience could be. That doesn't mean that I don't still move forward with the plan, because the plan's the plan, but having that empathy. The second thing I would say is that we don't know what is going on in a student's life. When a student has their head down in class and it's frustrating and they're disengaged, um, sometimes my first instinct is to assume the worst about that student, to assume they're being lazy, to assume they're unmotivated. And I just can't tell you how many times in my career that I've been completely wrong about that. Once I've actually talked to the student and not come down on that student with a hammer, but I think earlier in my career it would be me. If a kid was asleep in class or disengaged, I'd say, come on, you need to step it up. This is not okay. And I think now what I've, especially post COVID, but even before that, it's more, the conversation is more, hey, is everything okay? uh, is there anything you need? Because you don't know
Yeah.
what's going on, and sometimes you think you know what's going on, and you don't know. And so never try to avoid making assumptions about a student. Try to avoid making assumptions based on not just their behavior, but their appearance in any way, shape, or form. We just don't know. I can't tell you, I've taught AP all 16 of my years going into 17 years. And I it is not it is AP students have just as many mental health struggles and dysfunctional families and personal challenges as every other student who comes through the building. And the false assumption, I know, Shawn, you were Mr. AP student in high school. uh so it's a false assumption to assume that because these students are in the higher track of courses, that they have great lives at home and everything's perfect, and they just
Yeah.
go home to a perfect family and life is great. And that just is completely false, oftentimes.
100%. Yeah, it always struck me that that's a whole other conversation we could get in, but I don't. People are people, and you have to meet them where they are. And I love that both of these points have been just empathy and trying to understand other people and kind of withholding that judgment, which I think is something we all um, would benefit from in this world. And that's one of the things I work on as a coach a lot,
Yeah.
is trying to get there. Is there anything else that comes to mind? Trying to reach for three, but you don't have to for new teachers. So we have, you know, remember what it was like when you were a student, just to have that understanding of the student's experience. Don't assume you know what's going on in students' lives um, when their heads are down or anything. Is there any other kind of I wish I would have known this when I in my first couple of years of teaching?
uh yeah, I be yourself. Be yourself. Like, what students love is like a quirky, like proud to be quirky teacher. You know, like if you have a nerdy hobby like you and I do, Shawn.
Yeah,
For years I didn't tell anybody that I love Dungeons and Dragons, and we'd been playing since eighth grade. Because I thought, like, oh, that's what will people think, when they hear that about me.
yeah,
And that was just the completely wrong approach. Not because there's a whole bunch of kids who play Dungeons and Dragons in class and that I'll finally have a connection with these other students, because you'll find that out over time.
yeah,
But just be you. And what students need to see, especially students who don't have a lot of adult role models outside of school, is people is adults who are comfortable being themselves and who are willing to share the authentic versions of themselves and be comfortable with that, and even
Yeah.
if you're not into Dungeons and Dragons or whatever your hobby is, seeing other people who are comfortable with their hobbies and interests, even if they're not everybody else's, like, you need role models for that. You need role models to be like, this, okay, Mr. Hultgren loves Dungeons and Dragons and dice and, like, Lord of the Rings, and he makes these corny references, but he's okay with who he is as a person. He likes those things. And that's not my thing. I have a different thing, but it's nice to see somebody just being themselves, and being okay with not just liking football, and I love football, or talking about all these mainstream things.
Right on. I love that call to be authentic and role modeling that authenticness of just being yourself. I think so many times, um, one, you find meaning in connecting with people when your authentic self again, but it's also something that a lot of people don't think about is what am I teaching other people around me, even if I'm not meaning to, there's an unintended consequence of not sharing that. And then you seem like a one-dimensional person. People love that like you said, not a lot of people, not, I mean, there are people that are into Dungeons and Dragons, there are people that aren't, but knowing that you're passionate and nerding out about something, I think people enjoy. At least I do. That's why I do these podcasts. Like, this is so much fun,
Mhm.
just getting to know folks.
Yeah.
So, okay, a tougher question for you, and this is probably my favorite question, that I try to hit every podcast is, if someone had some skill as an educator, what 1 to 3 things would then take them to the next level? I think it's a lot of times it's easy to figure out the beginner stuff, but um, as someone that I know you're a really great educator, and I know you're always striving to reach that next level too. So what do you think helped you become from like a maybe an intermediate or novice to a higher end intermediate or novice
Yeah.
or expert? I don't think you. I mean, would you consider yourself an expert educator at this point, or
No, no,
okay?
no. Yeah, Marcus Aurelius said, don't focus on how far you've come, focus on how far you still have to go,
Hmm.
and I, I whenever I'm in that mindset, I'm growing and I'm learning and I'm more humble. When I'm not in that mindset, and I think I've like I kind of get into that, like, I puff my chest up in my head and I'm like, oh, I've got this all figured out. That's when I'm the worst. I'm the worst at it in every way, but um even now I'm literally halfway through my career. um Going into this year, I have another 17 years and I'm starting year 17, so I guess I have another semester before I'm at exactly a full school. But I just have so much farther to go before I'm the person that I really want to be, and I'm okay with that, but I think that's like the thing, right, for teachers. And you know eh, teaching is an incredible job, but it's a grind, and it can be grueling. And one of the sneaky things about teaching that can be challenging is that every year, like, you spend all year teaching a group of students a set skill or skills or content or knowledge, and then the next year, like, you're back to the beginning again, and the people that are in front of you don't have those skills yet, and then you get them to where they need to be, and then you start over. And
Yeah.
that there's a blessing to that, right, that you can always then change. It's almost like you get another redo and a redo and a redo.
Yeah.
But that's only valuable if you make changes, right? So that's the beauty of it, is you always get another shot at it. But you got to be willing to grow and make changes, and realize that, who you want to be, you're not there yet, and that there's always a better way to do it. And the teachers that I work with who seem the happiest, by and large operate under that mindset, right? That I'm not there yet, or still have a long way to go, or boy, we can make this even better next year. And the teachers I work with who seem the most miserable um, are not making changes year in and year out. You know, they they are very fixed in what they do, and a lot of it works. There's no doubt about it. You know, that it's not a knock on their teaching, but there's certainly growth to be had, and there's new ways to improve things. Um, and they're just not as interested in trying new things. And I think that will grind you out, because if you're never changing anything, then you're just thinking, I have to teach us I have 17 more times through this before I
Right.
can retire. Whereas for me, I'm every year I revisit what I did, and I like it less and less. And so I'll change it more and more. And it always feels fresh and it feels new because I'm trying to make it better than I did in the past, you know.
Yeah, I love that like growth mindset. I mean, growth mindset, you're role modeling, learning yourself, but it's not static. I think that's super important, and it gets it kicked out of you're just a gear in the process, like so awesome. Are there any other pieces of advice you'd give a novice to maybe intermediate, trying to get to an intermediate level of skill as an educator, other than mindset?
Uh I mean, you just have to have fun. I mean, you should be having fun even if you're tired, even if you're fatigued, and you're going to be um like the growth has to happen along with you're finding joy in the journey, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this question usually requires a little bit more thinking, so which is why I really like it.
Mm.
Um, so okay, kind of on that track then of have that learning mindset, have fun with it. Do you have any habits that you do as a teacher, or maybe just a little bit more in general in life that keep you on purpose, keep you connected to the work, help you find meaning as an educator every day, week, or month? I guess during the school year would probably be the most relevant, but
Other than drinking way too much coffee every morning.
yeah. Yeah.
um yeah, I mean, this is not a routine per se, but just talking to people and trying to the best things that I have done in my classroom, the ideas have not come almost always from other English teachers. They've come from hearing what the physics teacher is doing, what the math teacher is doing, how the special ed teacher is doing this thing to differentiate their instruction for students, and then um, really just trying to find a way. That's a really interesting idea. How can I incorporate that idea into my curriculum, or how can I take that and adjust it? And I'll give you an example, something that I don't know how I'm going to do this yet, Sean. Maybe you have an idea for me. Um, but our principal attended a conference, and we were in a meeting, and he shared this idea of, have you heard of the five whys?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I was new to me. I've never heard of the five whys. And so I can you describe the five whys, Sean, for our listeners?
The way that it's logged in my brain, it's you ask why 5 times to really get at the underlying beliefs or values or understanding of a particular like statement or question or content, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
Okay.
And so I like that is just ripe for critical thinking, digging
Mm,
into a character analysis of, a character in a novel, or really any topic you might discuss or may come up in class. And I'm just super excited to bring that thinking routine into my classroom this upcoming year. But again, that was like our principal just literally dropped that in passing,
Mhm.
And so, I'm just always on the lookout for little things that I can incorporate, and then finding that transfer, right? Like, how can I take that thing that's not happening in English, and find a way to bring it in?
So, in relation to the question of a habit that brings purpose, so to kind of try to tie it up, so it's engaging with peers and the people around you to gather ideas. Is the meaningful part that learning experience? Is the meaningful part the interaction with the colleagues and the folks around you that you're interacting with, and I assume students? Where are you finding the purpose in your job as an educator
The
through that?
meaningful part is that everything that I'm reading, experiencing, listening to, talking to colleagues, I'm vetting it through this filter of, is there something in this discussion? Is there something in this news article? Is there something in this Twitter thread? Is there something in this movie, in this YouTube video, in this podcast that I could bring back in? Okay. So, like, for example, I have a colleague who does this incredibly well, and she and I often share ideas. And so we're really into Stranger Things. We talk Stranger Things all the time. And we were talking about a podcast that we both happen to listen to, where they talk about, she had just resent it to me, but we listened to it before. They are talking about, at the end of season 3, Hopper leaves the note for Elle. Do you remember the end of that season?
Yeah.
Okay. And they do this like incredible discussion about the letter, like breaking it down, and how, like, it's just this really thoughtful analysis of, like, the letter and what it means and what some of the language might mean. And we're like, this is exactly what we want students to do when they discuss elements from our text that we're reading in class. Like, this level of, like, discussion and analysis and, like, energy is, like,
Hmm.
exactly what we want. And so we're like, when we get back in the fall, let's figure out how we can use the clip from this podcast as a way to model for our students what we want them to do. So is that like a blow your mind idea? No. But for me, my routine that brings meaningfulness and purpose is to just always be filtering things about, in a way that, could I use this? Could this make me a better teacher? Could this help my students? Could I take this and find a way to bring it in?
Okay. Yeah. So let me see if you agree with this statement. It's you're getting the meaningful and purpose from thinking about how to bring in, you're learning about things to bring into the classroom that will be of service to the student and make it fun and make it really create that experience where they connect with it in a way that's not as schooly. This is wordy, but it's an act of service and how you're viewing the world to bring it back into the classroom.
Yeah, it's a way for me to find every experience I have. There's Is there a relevance to what I'm experiencing that I could use to help my students better understand a concept, connect more to what we're doing? And then, as an instructional coach, because I know we haven't talked about that as much,
Yeah.
if I can't use it, is there a connection to something that I maybe worked with a teacher on, or I know would benefit a colleague, or we could bring into professional development? And so, a lot of times, I'm like the go-to, like, people will reach out to me often and say, hey, I'm doing this thing in class, do you have any ideas or things that could connect to this? And I'll send them a series of links that I've been saving on my phone, or I've just been making a mental catalog of, that I think really connect to that, or that would be interesting ideas. Because the routine is that I've tried to train my brain to be vetting everything through that lens of, could this help myself or a colleague?
Right on. Okay, I love that. So that said, my man, I think we're at the end of our hour. We've covered so much really amazing things. I really, if you're listening to this, go back. I'll have the synopsis in the notes below the podcast, and I do my little bit after the podcast to kind of pull out the things that we've learned. I really love the theme of this learning mindset, which seems to be really at the core of everything you do. Of how do you get better as a teacher, as an educator, as an instructional coach? How are you bringing those learnings to your students, to your peers? Building this community. Highlighting those relationships. Um, I think we could probably sum the conversation that main idea, but just curious for you, like what was something that you really loved about our conversation or highlight um, that you've shared so far today? If you could think of one.
Yeah, I've just enjoyed revisiting with you high school. Like I think
Yeah.
like in some ways high school is the same, in a lot of ways, like for all the talk about how teenagers these days and this and that, like there's teenagers are teenagers, when you break it all down. I mean, they have different technology and they have different access to things that we didn't have, but in a lot of ways things haven't changed very much, and then in a lot of ways they've changed, tremendously. So it's interesting talking about that
Yeah.
piece.
100%. So, well, I absolutely love this conversation.
Same.
Thank you again for agreeing to be on this podcast, and just spending time. Like it's always good seeing you. So, all right, man. That said, thank you so much,
Yeah,
and we'll see. I'll talk to you really soon.
sounds good,
So,
buddy. Thanks for having me.
you got it. All right, so on today's episode, it was really, really great to talk with James on his experience teaching and the three big takeaways that you can apply to your life that might help you feel a little bit more meaningful each day is to number one, remember that empathy is the key to helping anyone, not just students in his case. That ability to remember where other people were can really serve you. Second, do not assume why someone isn't performing. So you have to kind of ask, and is it a family member passed away? Is it hard times? Not to let people get away with things, but to just understand where they're coming from. And always, especially in personal development, be yourself and to be authentic. So know who you are and how you are showing up every day. It's stuff that I do every day as a coach. So that said, if you would really love to help the podcast and join the meaningful revolution, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe and leave a comment, because that helps us out, helps us get the word out, and that would be great. Second, you can always learn more about me or my coaching program at shawn.coach. That's www.shawn.coach. And you can go and explore my website from there. So on the next episode, we have my good friend, Dr. Emmanuel George, who's going to talk about leadership as a pharmacist, right? He's had a really winding career. We get into some really great stuff. I know you'll love it. I'm excited to share it with you. So we'll see you guys then. Take care.